The internet was stunned when Tamar Braxton and her sister Ashley Braxton finally opened up about a period they claim was defined by silence, pressure, and fear of consequences. For years, fans questioned why certain stories were never addressed publicly, why tensions felt unresolved, and why moments that seemed explosive were met with quiet restraint. Now, according to Tamar and Ashley, that silence wasn't accidental, it was enforced. In recent conversations circulating online, the sisters suggested that their decision to stay quiet wasn't about avoiding drama, but about survival in an industry where power dynamics can dictate who gets heard and who doesn't. They described an environment where speaking out felt risky, where relationships, opportunities, and reputations were all hanging in the balance. While they stopped short of making legal accusations, their words painted a picture of behind-the-scenes pressure that left them feeling boxed in and voiceless. Fans immediately connected their statements to long-standing tension involving Evelyn Lozada, a name that has surfaced repeatedly in discussions about unresolved conflict and unspoken history. Tamar and Ashley didn't frame their experience as an attack, they framed it as an explanation for years of unanswered questions, an explanation for why certain truths from their perspective never reached the public when emotions were at their peak. What made this moment resonate wasn't anger, it was exhaustion. Tamar spoke about the emotional weight of carrying stories she felt unable to share, while Ashley echoed the frustration of watching narratives form without their voices included. The sisters emphasized that silence can be misinterpreted as guilt or weakness, when in reality it can be the result of calculated restraint. In industries driven by contracts, alliances, and unspoken rules, silence is sometimes the price of staying afloat. Social media reacted instantly. Some fans praised the sisters for finally reclaiming their voices, saying their explanation shed light on why certain reality TV conflicts never fully made sense. Others urged caution, reminding everyone that multiple perspectives exist and that silence can have many causes. Still, the conversation exploded because it challenged a familiar assumption that people stay quiet because they have nothing to say. Now the biggest question isn't about blame, it's about power. Who gets to speak freely and who feels pressured to wait? Because when silence lasts this long, breaking it doesn't just reopen old wounds, it forces people to reconsider everything they thought they understood. And as Tamar and Ashley's words continue to circulate, one thing is clear: the quiet wasn't peace, it was restraint. And restraint, once lifted, changes the entire story. To understand why this moment feels so significant, fans say you have to revisit the time period Tamar and Ashley are referring to, not as isolated drama, but as a moment shaped by power dynamics that often go unseen. During that era, Tamar Braxton was navigating intense public scrutiny while balancing contracts, network expectations, and personal boundaries. According to the sisters' perspective, the environment wasn't one where everyone had equal freedom to speak. Instead, it was one where influence, alliances, and reputational risk quietly dictated who could say what and when. Ashley described feeling sidelined in conversations that directly affected her, watching narratives form in real time without any opportunity to correct them. From her point of view, silence wasn't consent, it was a condition imposed by circumstance. She suggested that the fear wasn't just backlash from fans, but professional consequences, being labeled difficult, losing access, or being frozen out of opportunities. In reality, TV and entertainment more broadly, those labels can follow someone for years, shaping how they're treated long after the moment passes. The sisters' comments inevitably brought renewed attention to Evelyn Lozada, not as an accusation of wrongdoing, but as a symbol of the imbalance they felt at the time. Fans noted that Evelyn's established position and visibility created a dynamic where challenging the narrative felt risky. Tamar and Ashley didn't claim legal threats or explicit gag orders. Instead, they described a quieter kind of pressure, the understanding that speaking up could cost more than staying silent. That kind of pressure, they argued, is harder to prove but just as effective. What changed now is timing. Tamar is in a different phase of her career and personal life, with more control over her platform and fewer incentives to protect relationships that no longer serve her. Ashley, too, appears more comfortable asserting her voice without fear of immediate repercussions. Speaking now isn't about rewriting history, it's about adding context that was missing when emotions were highest and options were limited. From their perspective, clarity arrives when leverage shifts. Fans also pointed out how long silence can distort perception. Over time, unanswered stories harden into assumptions. Viewers fill gaps with their own interpretations, often favoring the loudest or most visible voice. Tamar and Ashley suggested that by waiting, they watched versions of events settle into truth without their input. Breaking silence now, even years later, is their attempt to rebalance that record, not to win an argument, but to explain why they couldn't participate in it before. Another reason this matters now is cultural. Audiences are more aware of NDAs, informal pressure, and the ways industries discourage dissent without explicit rules. What once sounded like excuses, "I couldn't talk," now resonates as a familiar reality for many creators. The sisters' story fits into a broader conversation about who controls narratives and how silence is often misread by those outside the system. The response has reflected that shift. Supporters say the explanation finally makes earlier events make sense, while critics caution against reopening old wounds without full context. Both reactions underscore the same point: power shapes storytelling. When some voices are louder by default, others have to choose between speaking and surviving. Tamar and Ashley's decision to speak now suggests they believe the balance has finally tipped enough to tell their side without disproportionate cost. As this chapter unfolds, the focus moves away from assigning blame and toward understanding systems. The sisters aren't asking audiences to pick sides as much as they're asking them to reconsider assumptions. Silence doesn't always mean agreement. Sometimes it means waiting for safety, for leverage, or for the right moment to be heard. And for Tamar and Ashley, that moment, they say, is now. As Tamar and Ashley's explanation spread, fan reactions revealed just how deeply silence can be misinterpreted in the reality TV ecosystem. Supporters flooded comment sections, saying the sisters' words finally connected dots that never made sense before. Moments that once felt evasive or confusing now appeared strategic, choices made to avoid professional fallout rather than to dodge accountability. For many viewers, this reframing was powerful because it challenged a long-held assumption that whoever speaks loudest must be telling the full truth. The idea that silence could be a survival tactic resonated strongly, especially with audiences more aware of how entertainment industries operate behind the scenes. At the same time, skepticism remained. Some fans questioned why the story was being revisited now, arguing that time blurs memory and that multiple perspectives deserve space. Others worried that revisiting old conflicts risks reigniting negativity without offering resolution. These concerns weren't dismissive as much as cautious, reflecting an audience increasingly aware of how narratives can be reshaped long after the fact. Still, even critics acknowledged that the sisters' explanation added missing context to a chapter that had always felt incomplete. The broader conversation quickly expanded beyond individuals to systems. Viewers began discussing informal pressure, unwritten rules that don't require contracts or threats to be effective. In reality TV, reputation is currency. Being labeled difficult or uncooperative can quietly end opportunities regardless of talent. Fans noted that this kind of pressure rarely shows up on camera, yet it profoundly shapes what audiences see. When cast members choose silence, producers fill the gap with edits, confessionals, and reaction shots that imply meaning where none may exist. Over time, implication becomes canon. This dynamic explains why silence is often punished on reality TV. Audiences expect transparency, but the format rewards conflict. When someone opts out, the absence itself becomes a storyline. Viewers then read intention into pauses, body language, and reduced screen time. The sisters' account highlighted how that process can lock people into narratives they never chose. Once the edit suggests distance or guilt, correcting it requires speaking, sometimes at great personal cost. Industry pressure compounds this effect. Networks and producers prioritize continuity and momentum. Challenging a narrative mid-season can disrupt story arcs, which makes silence the safer option for cast members with less leverage. Tamar and Ashley's comments suggested they understood this calculus at the time. Speaking might have provided short-term relief but long-term consequences. Waiting preserved options, even if it meant absorbing public misunderstanding. Fan discourse also revealed a shift in empathy. Many viewers drew parallels to NDAs and informal, keep quiet, cultures across entertainment, sports, and corporate spaces. The sisters' story became a touchstone for conversations about who controls narratives and why waiting to speak can be rational rather than deceptive. That shift didn't erase disagreement, but it softened judgment. People began asking better questions. Who benefits when someone stays silent? Who pays the cost when they speak? Another notable reaction was fatigue with certainty. After years of watching conflicts reduced to winners and losers, some fans welcomed nuance. They didn't want verdicts, they wanted context. Tamar and Ashley's framing, focused on pressure rather than accusation, met that appetite. By avoiding absolutes, they invited reflection instead of pylons. That approach helped keep the conversation from collapsing into sides, even as passions ran high. Still, reality TV's structure makes misreading silence almost inevitable. The medium thrives on immediacy, while restraint thrives on time. When those values collide, restraint loses in the short term. What Tamar and Ashley's story illustrates is that time can rebalance that equation. Speaking later doesn't change what happened, but it can change how it's understood. It can turn assumed motives into examined conditions. As reactions continue, the conversation is moving toward a more mature place, one that acknowledges power, timing, and the cost of voice. The sisters didn't ask audiences to rewrite history, they asked them to reconsider it. And in doing so, they exposed a central truth of reality TV: silence is rarely empty. It's often full of calculation, fear, and patience, elements the camera can't capture but the audience can learn to recognize. As the conversation deepened, attention turned to what Tamar and Ashley meant when they described being forced into silence, because in most cases, that force doesn't look like a courtroom order or a signed document waved in someone's face. Instead, it shows up as layered pressure, media framing that narrows options, industry norms that reward compliance, and reputational risks that punish dissent. When Tamar Braxton and Ashley Braxton talked about staying quiet, they were describing a system that doesn't need explicit gag orders to be effective. One of the most powerful tools in that system is framing. Media doesn't just report events, it organizes them into narratives that feel complete. Once a narrative sets, stepping outside it becomes costly. For cast members on reality TV, challenging a dominant storyline can mean being edited unfavorably, sidelined in confessionals, or portrayed as defensive. Silence in that environment can feel like the least harmful option, not because it's fair, but because it's predictable. You know the cost of silence, you don't know the cost of speaking. NDAs add another layer, even when they're not the primary constraint. Non-disclosure agreements are common in entertainment, but they're often broader than audiences realize. They can cover behind-the-scenes processes, production decisions, and internal disputes, not just plot points. Even when an NDA doesn't explicitly forbid speaking, it can create enough ambiguity to make people hesitate. The risk of breaching terms, even accidentally, can be enough to keep someone quiet. Tamar and Ashley suggested that ambiguity itself was part of the pressure, not knowing where the line was, only that crossing it could have consequences. Then there's the social dimension: alliances, influence, and perception. In reality TV ecosystems, proximity to power matters. Established figures tend to have stronger relationships with producers, networks, and media outlets. When conflict arises, those relationships can shape whose perspective gets amplified and whose gets sidelined. Without accusing anyone of wrongdoing, the sisters pointed to how imbalance works in practice. One voice gets immediate access to platforms, while another is advised, formally or informally, to wait. Waiting becomes silence. Silence becomes misinterpretation. Media amplification compounds this effect. Once one version of events circulates widely, counter-narratives face higher skepticism. Audiences ask why the response is late, not why it was constrained. Timing gets weaponized against the quieter party. Tamar and Ashley's explanation reframed that dynamic by shifting the question from "why didn't you speak?" to "what made speaking risky at the time?" That reframing matters because it challenges a default assumption that access is equal. Another underappreciated factor is the role of intermediaries, publicists, managers, legal advisors, whose job is to minimize risk. Advice to stay quiet is often well-intentioned. It's about protecting long-term interests, avoiding escalation, and preserving options. But that advice can also trap people in narratives they didn't choose. Over time, the gap between lived experience and public perception widens. When Tamar and Ashley finally spoke, they weren't correcting a single statement. They were addressing years of accumulated inference. The sisters' story also highlights how forced silence can be situational rather than absolute. You might be free to speak in theory, but constrained in practice by timing, leverage, and platform access. Early in a conflict, the cost of speaking can be highest. Contracts are active, relationships are fragile, and reputational labels stick easily. Later, when leverage shifts, the same words carry less risk. Speaking now doesn't change the past. It changes the conditions under which the past is discussed. Importantly, this doesn't require villains to function. Systems can produce pressure without malicious intent. Producers seek compelling television. Networks seek stability. Media seeks clarity. Together, those incentives can narrow the range of acceptable speech. People who don't fit neatly into the narrative learn quickly that silence is safer than complexity. Tamar and Ashley's account suggests they made that calculation, consciously or not, and lived with its consequences. As fans absorbed this explanation, many began reassessing how they consume reality TV. If silence can be coerced by circumstance, then certainty becomes suspect. The absence of a response doesn't necessarily reflect agreement or guilt. It may reflect strategy or self-preservation. That realization doesn't solve disputes, but it changes how responsibility is assigned. By the end of this phase, the conversation had matured. It wasn't about proving who was right. It was about recognizing how power, framing, and timing shape what gets said and what doesn't. Forced silence, as Tamar and Ashley described it, wasn't a single act. It was an environment. And understanding that environment is essential if audiences want to interpret reality TV with care rather than reflex. As this conversation reaches its final chapter, what stands out most isn't accusation or blame, it's awareness. The decision by Tamar Braxton and Ashley Braxton to finally speak reframed years of silence not as avoidance, but as calculation shaped by power, timing, and risk. Their explanation didn't rewrite history, it complicated it. And in doing so, it challenged how audiences interpret quiet moments in a medium that thrives on noise. One of the biggest takeaways is that silence on reality TV is rarely neutral. It's often strategic, sometimes protective, and occasionally imposed by circumstances viewers never see. When Tamar and Ashley described feeling unable to speak freely, they highlighted a truth many creators understand. Access to platforms isn't evenly distributed. Influence determines who gets heard immediately and who is advised to wait. That imbalance doesn't require explicit threats to be effective. It operates through reputational risk, contractual uncertainty, and the fear of being permanently mislabeled. This moment also shifts expectations for future conflicts. Fans are increasingly aware of NDAs, informal pressure, and media framing, which means silence may no longer be read as simply having nothing to say. That awareness encourages better questions. Instead of asking why someone stayed quiet, viewers may start asking what made speaking costly at the time. That shift doesn't excuse harm or settle disputes, but it creates space for nuance, something reality TV sorely lacks. For the industry, the implications are just as important. Stories like this invite networks and producers to consider how edits, timing, and access shape public understanding. When only one perspective dominates, silence fills the gaps with assumptions. Greater transparency won't eliminate conflict, but it can reduce misinterpretation. For audiences, the lesson is media literacy. Understanding that what's shown is curated, and what's unsaid may be constrained rather than absent. Ultimately, Tamar and Ashley's words didn't demand agreement, they invited reconsideration. They asked viewers to revisit old narratives with fresh context, and to recognize that timing can be as powerful as truth. Speaking now doesn't change what happened then, but it changes how those moments are understood going forward. What do you think? Do you believe silence on reality TV is usually a choice, or a consequence of power and pressure? Should audiences allow space for delayed truth, or does timing undermine credibility? Share your thoughts in the comments. Like the video if this breakdown helped you see beyond the surface. Subscribe for long-form storytelling that values context, nuance, and responsible discussion. Because in a world built on loud narratives, sometimes the most important stories are the ones that took time to be told.